So pretty much the three main points that I wanted to cover is, what's the point of dairy goats? What's the point of dairy milk? Why is this industry out there and been growing? What type of producers have enrolled in the industry? What are their motivations and what are their expectations? And then hit some highlights on industry norms. And I say that laughing a little bit in the US because it's hard to describe a typical goat dairy because of the diversity on operations, the diversity you're going to see when you go through the NAHMS program. When I compare that to other parts of the world that I've been in, I spent time in the Netherlands working with their goat dairy, especially after the Coxiella outbreaks. I work with colleagues from New Zealand. Those are a lot more homogenous as far as what the industry and the farms and the practices look like. Here, it's definitely not. The other thing I put up there, a couple key sources that I use for this talk, data that came out of association and breed information, DHIA data, certainly the NAHMS from 10 years ago, 2009 on the goat NAHMS, and some of our ag and marketing statistics. If it's written up there and has a number behind it, it probably came from one of those sources. If I'm just telling you off the cuff, then that's where I'm more likely to draw on my experience and what I've seen. With the caveat, again, that we have a lot of diversity. Just because I saw things one way on a bunch of farms doesn't mean you're going to go find up an operation and have it be totally different. Okay, so why dairy goats? This is a group of sonins. Fairly conventional dairy goat parlor that's up there. It's got a pit in the middle for the producer. It's a parallel. I can't count too well, but maybe about 15 or so on each side. A lot of these parlors, those milking units, when they're commercial, they'll swing them one side to the other side. And they may or may not be using modified cow equipment. So instead of 4 claws on a cluster, they might have 2. And then these girls, usually it's pretty normal to have them on a concentrate type of ration in the parlor, so you see some feed on that front feeder. Okay. Most of us, when we think dairy goats and we think dairy milk production, we start thinking about dairy goat cheese. So the chèvre or the soft cheeses is what's most popular here in the US. Most of the dairy milk that's out there that's getting sold commercially, or even from the direct sales, is going into some kind of cheese product. But what I find on a lot of farms, for people that get into it, we do have a fair amount of fluid goat milk that gets out on the market. There's a point in time where if you want a fluids goat's milk, you're basically looking for the canned stuff that was on the shelves. And now it's a lot more common to be able to find goat's milks, even in pretty typical supermarkets, that is a fresh pasteurized product, or depending on the state, unpasteurized in a half gallon or gallon settings. And some of our clients that got into goat milking did it because of the fluid milk, and they did it because of the kids. There are some unique properties on dairy goat milk. That means that if you have often a kid with allergies to cow's milk, goat's milk becomes an acceptable supplement, okay? So whether it's an allergy to the milk protein or whether it's just because it's more easily digestible. The fat globules in dairy goat milk tend to be smaller. It's a little bit more naturally emulsified or naturally homogenized. Digestion is quicker in the human GI tract, a little bit more gentle on the human GI tract. And then for cheese production, there's some differences as far as softer curd. What that means is that for the US, we're looking at basically about a $90+ million industry on a sales or a cash market, so it's nothing to sneeze at now, and it's been growing. We've been looking at about a 4% growth on the dairy goat industry fairly consistently over the years. So to put some of this in perspective, since we're more familiar with cows, we're talking a little bit about milk composition. On the left side of this, I've got a Jersey cow. Those of you that are familiar with dairy cows know they're a little smaller. They don't make as much, but they're prized especially for cheese production or butter because of higher components. Compared to the workhorse of our cattle dairy industry, the Holstein on the right? Large framed animals, they do make a lot of milk really well. So for milk fat, for cattle, we're looking at about a little under 5% for Jersey, compared to our average whole milk on the Holstein breed is a little bit under 4% before we've taken any fat out. We want to compare that on the dairy goat side. Over on the left, I kind of have the Jersey of the dairy goats. It's the Nigerian dwarf, right? They're small creatures. They're typically known, relative dairy goats, to have high components. Milk yield is small. If you're actually milking these guys instead of for pets, you might be measuring it in cups. And we're going to compare that to this white goat on the right. It's a Saanen breed. And Saanen is the kind of the Holstein of the dairy goat industry. They tend large frame goats. They're all white, make a lot of milk, but our components are going to be a little bit less than some of the other breeds. And I will say that on the dairy goat side, when you start looking at references for components like fat and protein, it gives you a pretty wide range that goes around those averages. And that has a lot to do with the individual goat, the genetics, the nutritional program, where they are at lactation, and the management style. Okay, so we're seeing right here, Nigerian dwarf, up over 6% breed average for milk fat. Saanens really aren't that, they're pretty comparable to our Holstein as far as a little bit over 3% for milk fat in them. So we always think about all the extra components or fat in goat's milk compared to cattle milk, and it really depends on the operation and the breed. Okay, similarly for protein, Jersey to Holstein, we're looking somewhere in the 3% range, a little bit higher on the Jersey side. You start talking about dairy goats, up over 4% milk protein, which is good, again, for cheese production. On the Nigerian dwarf, we get over into commercial Saanens, and we might find that that protein level is really not as high as you might assume, considering what we commonly hold to be truths about goats versus cattle milk. And then production, right? So these are breed averages right now for the Jersey and the Holstein. Translates to about maybe 7 gallons a day on the Jersey side, about 9 gallons a day on average for a high-producing Holstein, knowing that lactation's not flat, right? We have peaks and it tails off. We want to compare that on the Nigerian dwarf and the Saanen right here. Nigerian dwarf, to be honest, that half gallon seems pretty optimistic for me for a lot of the farms. This is DHIA data. And what we see on the goat side is that we have a lot of herds that aren't truly commercial herds that do participate in DHIA, and they're there because they show, right? So the people that we have milking data for Nigerian dwarfs are probably pretty heavy on show lines and are producing a little bit more than you might expect. And then over on the far side, about 1 gallon a day for a Saanen. And I'll say that that estimate's probably low. A really good producing commercial type of dairy doe can probably produce about 150% of what's up there. And we've got does that are producing well over 5,000 pounds in basically a standardized, roughly 305-day lactation period. So about 2 gallons a day from a goat. Okay. So where is this happening? Right now, 2017 numbers for herd census is about under 400,000, but they tend to cluster into about 3 main regions. I highlighted the Midwest area. That's certainly a top region for dairy goat production. I came out of Iowa State before I was here, so we dealt with this milk shed quite a bit. Saputo now owns the creamery that's up in Wisconsin. They've got creameries right across the border in Canada as well, and that's where most of that Midwest milk that's commercial is headed towards. So Wisconsin and Iowa in the top 2. Certainly West Coast then is pretty predominant. So California as a single state has quite a number of dairy goats. Not really a surprise with the rest of the dairy infrastructure there. Texas didn't make the top 5 here, but also historically has a pretty strong dairy goat population in addition to the strength in the meat goat numbers down there. And then the Northeast collectively has a relative density of dairy goat operations. So few states that have high numbers, but we're more likely if we go out to a random goat operation in the Northeast, it's more likely to have dairy goats as opposed to meat, fiber, or other purposes than other parts of the country. Okay. That said, when we start looking at dairy goat milk production across the world, we don't even register, right? This is goat milk production in tons, and you'll see that the major milk centers are located over in Asia. They're located up in the EU and some in the South America. That $90 million industry that I talked about on a global scale really doesn't even make a dent. So where is this goat's milk going? For our large operations, and a lot of this came from 10 years ago from NAHMS, so their small operations were generally less than about 10 milking does. Medium-sized operations, depending on where they're on the list, we're kind of in that 10 to 100-ish range, large over 100. And so these larger operations, most of them, 70%, are headed to some kind of commercial processor. Again, the majority of that is going to cheese. We have a number of operations that will sell direct to retail or direct to restaurant as well. And then as we move and we start talking about the smaller folks, especially those that are milking, less than 10 goats, 10 to 20 goats, maybe up to 100, they're more likely to do direct to consumer sales in one way, shape, or form. In the places I'll see that you may have farms that have a retail establishment, a retail shop on the property that they sell from. You may have operations that are selling through a farmer's market type of setup. Pretty good number of internet sales that are out there. So Craigslist was the place to go find goat's milk for a long time. Facebook groups on the Facebook marketplace, similarly, I don't see the raw milk pop up there quite as much as I do compared to what the Craigslist ads will do, or just on farm with a farm website. Raw sales for these direct to consumer actually exceed pasteurized milk sales. So that's something to keep in mind as you're going through the questionnaires. And then the purposes of the stuff getting sold will usually come into one of three places. We'll see sales for livestock. Okay, I know plenty of people that will feed excess milk to pigs, right, and raise pork off of it. Maybe it's being sold as a replacer for other species that are out there. Pet sales is something that you're going to run to pretty commonly, and I will say it's been my experience when I've lived in states that do not allow raw milk, and we're looking at the Craigslist listings, that they will advertise raw goat's milk for sale for pet purposes, right? Wink, wink, right? Nobody selling it expects it to go to pets, and just about nobody buying it is paying those prices for it to go to their dog or a cat. It's just their way of trying to stay under the radar for illegal raw sales to people. And then states like Colorado, where we have raw milk is allowed, certainly it'll be marketed openly for humans consumption.
Do most, I know what Kentucky, what the raw laws are, but do most states, what's the majority of states, do they allow raw milk sales or?
That's a good question, but we could probably answer with the group. I don't know where we're at in terms of exact numbers. Majority do, majority don't. I've lived in a number of states, and most of the states I've lived in restrict or don't allow raw milk sales. And so Colorado, for me, has been a little bit of a surprise in the fact that we have so many raw milk clients out there. Any comments from people from around the country?
There's a website maintained by a couple individuals who work in regulatory medicine, their name's safety, that's the real raw milk facts.
Yep.
And you can go on there and click on each state and it'll tell you the laws of that state. So it's all like one place.
Yeah. And most of the places I've been, it's been an evolving conversation. It seems like if they don't allow raw sales, it's on the docket of conversation every single year.
One of the things back when we had the scraping program, certification program, before it became the export certification program, it basically eliminated the desire to get that's another thing. But anyway, I had a couple of goat dairies that really would like to be a fully functioning goat dairy, but they didn't have a good way of processing. Didn't have any co-op and didn't have anybody that would go off.
Yep.
So it's really kind of a shame that we're limited. And I'm not saying we ought to legalize the bill, but it's a shame they don't have a better outlet.
There's a reason why these states and these regions are top for milk production. So, and I can give you an example from when I was in Iowa, but I was over at ISU, right in Ames, pretty much center. Within our bubble of our ambulatory practice, the only dairy goats we saw fell into realistically one of two categories: people that showed dairy goats and people that had pet goats that were classified as dairy goat breeds and may or may not do some personal use or some cheese making and stuff at home. Maybe there are a few herds around that did some on-farm processing for cheeses and stuff like that. If I drove an hour, so basically just outside of our practice radius for the university, I would be in an area where pretty much everywhere you looked, you'd see a commercial dairy goat farm because they were within the pickup zone for the processor over in Wisconsin, right?
So that was the question I was gonna ask you a while ago, why is all that new distinction? Because that's the main factor as to why that you have these milk sheds where they are.
Yeah.
Processors.
It's predominantly processor driven for the larger commercial operations, which it goes back to kind of my opening statement of you're going to, I can't really tell you. I can tell you what I've seen. I can tell you what the survey said is kind of most common with a big variance, but I can't tell you what the farm you're going to go to looks like because I will go onto a farm of somebody that just wanted to have a goat and they bought a dairy goat or two. And if you have a dairy goat or two as a pet, you're eventually going to try the milk, right? That's life. And I can go to another farm next door that's got some kids showing 4-H, right? Or they're into a pure, ADGA members and into showing of their breed of choice. And maybe they have a half a dozen goats or maybe they have 30 goats, right? And they're predominantly show oriented, but the animals make milk. And then I can go to another operation that's gotten really into like artisan cheese production and has the dairy goats to make the milk to make the cheese, and then they're selling that cheese off the farm or at a farmer's market or whatnot as direct sales. But when you start to get into those big commercial guys, then yeah, that's processor driven for location. And usually what will happen in those areas is the processor is there or accessible and people see an opportunity. So maybe they had goats at a small scale and they see an opportunity to expand and make it an economic driver for the farm. Or maybe that people don't have goats, but they see an opportunity to get into this new industry or new area. Again, clients that I had started with a couple dairy goats because their kids were allergic to their cow's milk, right? They were in an area with a processor, turned into a 150 head milking herd. Yeah, not overnight, but in general with goat's milk, we don't have a ton of fluid consumption still in the U.S. Most of it's cheese, so there's certainly added value, no matter what the market chain is, for added money and income coming when you add value to make it into, again, cheese is a big one. Other things you'll see, some sweets, so like goat's milk fudge. You can find that pretty easily. People will use it for soaps and other toiletries. Sometimes yogurts. And then about 75% of the farms that have dairy goats will use the milk in some form or function for goat kid rearing as opposed to human kid. That may be because they're letting the goats nurse the dams. It may be that they're milking the goats out and then bottle feeding that back to the kids. And then again, almost as many, about 67%, will use the milk for some form of home consumption. So that may not be exclusive. They may have a primary sales goal, but some of that milk's going to get diverted for the family. So for the major breeds that are out there, I'm going to hit on a few of them. This goat right here, the La Mancha, is the one everyone remembers if you know no other goats. That's because it has either really tiny or no ears, right? It's not cut off or anything. It's just a genetic mutation that people thought was fun, so it stuck around as a breed characteristic. Pretty large frame goat. And that begs the question, if you have a La Mancha goat, where do you put your scrapie ID, right? Or your herd registration tattoo, which is usually it's a farm prefix and a herd number. Where you will look for that is over here on the tail web. So the left tail web would correspond with the left ear location for another goat. Right tail web would correspond with the right ear location for a different type of tattoo. You will find in general when you start looking at dairy goats and you start looking for scrapie tags, you won't, especially if you get in the Nigerian dwarf world, you're not going to see as many tags out there. If the herd has registered tattoos and they've registered that with the scrapie program, usually we'll see tattooing for the purebreds as a primary means of identification rather than tagging. Okay, if you're out on a commercial farm and less registered animals, then obviously you'll see tags again. Okay, another one that's pretty recognizable, nice big frame goats, is Nubian. These guys have the long floppy ears. They tend to have a little bit more condition and body on them. They're kind of like the shorthorn of dairy cattle in a certain way. Tend to see a lot of these guys crossed out a little bit more with boar goats on some of these mixed operation, or if you've got a meat goat operation that wants to add a little bit more milk in the dam lines. Kind of known for being annoying, right? These are the really vocal, screamy goats that want Brahma llamas. They want your attention, right? The attention seekers all of the time. And then the other one that we see a lot of, though not necessarily in a dairy capacity, are these Nigerian dwarfs. So Nigerian dwarfs and pygmy goats are two different breeds. A lot of clients that own them don't necessarily know that. We do see a fair amount of interbreeding and blended animals between them. But when you look, a dairy cow should be framey, right? She should be refined and have some bone and be framey versus a beef cow that's stocky. And same thing with Nigerian dwarfs versus pygmies. That Nigerian dwarf, you shaved all that hair and fuzz off of them, should have that frame, okay, and refined appearance of a dairy characteristic animal versus a little bit more of a stocky-based pygmy. Where I see most of these guys is pets, right? This is the goat that sleeps in the owner's bed, right? This is the goat on most operations that is on the goat yoga farm, or going with the petting zoo, or the ones that 9 times out of 10, if you look at goats for sale on Craigslist or on Facebook, they're probably going to be Nigerian dwarf breeds, just because there's so many of them around, because they're cute and they're fluffy, and the kids are like a pound at birth, which is crazy when you're the vet trying to help them live. They are technically a dairy breed. Most people that own them don't really milk them. There are a few, solid, dedicated devotees and mostly the show crowd that really like them and will put up with milking the little teats and the little udders. The good dairy lines are a little bit better to milk than what you see on the pet side. When we start talking about equipment that's out there, all the other standard breeds kind of has standard size milking equipment and inflations. But if you have Nigerian dwarfs, you're getting a special smaller teacup and smaller inflations to go with them. And then again, a half a gallon was listed as daily average for the breed. That's a little bit skewed. I mean, I know there's plenty of people that are backyard dairy goat with Nigerian dwarfs trying to milk these guys out that are pretty excited when they can get like a cup and a half. Okay. I showed you the sauna before. This big white goat. They're all white all the time. It's kind of the workhorse of the industry. When I go out on dairy, even commercial dairy operations here in the U.S., I usually don't see one of it's same thing. I usually see this nice hodgepodge of stuff, or at least among our bigger breeds, right? Maybe not big breeds and Nigerians mixed together. When I was over in the Netherlands, one of the funny things on that is that their dairy goat breed herd nationally is pretty much 100% Saanen. Okay, when we start talking about lactation and you start asking clients about dry days and stuff like that, we're not really quite there in the U.S. as a norm, though I know individual goats and individual producers that are getting there. But when I was in the Netherlands, their norm is to breed dairy goats twice in their life. Once the calf usually as a year, or not calf, kid usually as a yearling, they'll have a 1 year, 305-day, 10-month lactation, dry off for about 60 days-ish. They're bred again to kid in as a 2-year-old, and then they're milked continuously for the next few years. Okay, that their genetic herd have been selected for that. The milk production basis and persistency in lactation is good enough that that's economically worthwhile. We have some people here in the States that have individual goats, tend to be a little bit more on this lineage, that they are persistent enough they can milk them through, not usually forever, but maybe get a 2-year lactation instead of a 10-month lactation out of them. Okay, then Alpine, this goat comes in all sorts of colors, and they have lots of funky names for them, and I let the clients tell me what it's supposed to be. It's a little bit like horses. But pretty standard. It's probably what's in most people's mind mentally is like this prototypical dairy goat are these Alpines. Couple related breeds then. Toggenburgs will all look like this. Okay, so derived fundamentally related to the Alpine lineage. And then this is an Americanized breed. It was used to be known as a Swiss Alpine, the Overwear Hosley. And again, coloring on these guys will all be the same. And a breed of aficionados will tell you about all the good characteristics of each one, but I mentally kind of think Alpine Tog, Oberhausley share a lot of similarities with each other because of their origins. So who's milking goats and what are we going to see on herds? A lot of herds out there that fall in that less than 10 goat category for one reason or the other. Hobby, pet, showing, 4-H stuff certainly would fall in that category. Those moderately sized herds are less than 100. Depending on where you're at, 30 to 50 goats is where people start jumping into that threshold for too much milk and needing some kind of extra. They're looking for commercial outlet for it. And if they're in the right place, they'll turn commercial. If they're not in the right place, they'll either downsize to keep the herd more manageable or they'll find another use. So one example, this would be a good example of someone that's on that cusp, is a colleague of mine that shows dairy goats, purebred togs. We'll continue to have and show purebred togs. They use some milk for home for cheese and soaps and whatnot. And they were in the probably about a 18 or so milking doe line and had more milk than they can handle for home consumption and needed an outlet for it. Looked at going commercial. In their case, the county requirements for water and wastewater management were cost prohibitive. It didn't make sense for them to go into a commercial outlet on the dairy, so they found another way with livestock to repurpose that milk. I know I have other colleagues that were in the same place. They're in this borderline zone, more milk than they can handle, have goats for some other reason, and then they have a choice. They either figure out how to make cheese and sell it if they don't have a processor close enough, or they wind up feeding livestock usually off of it. And then if you're close enough to a processor in a milk shed area, though, that's where you're going to start looking to set up that relationship and start turning it into an economic part of your household income. And we certainly get dairy goat operations now that are purpose put together that are in the 1,000 or thousands of goat range. So these are a little bit of an old stat, so the numbers have changed, but California 10 years ago maybe had 5 herds that were at that about 1,000, 1,200 goat range. With Saputo up in Wisconsin and Canada, there are some places where they're looking at putting in some dairy goat herds that are in about the 5,000 head range on them. So we will see a few big major operations in these commercial milk shed areas. For goat owners, supposedly the average is about 13 years in the industry. So compared to some of our other commodity groups, like people that raise swine or people that are in dairy cattle that have probably had some generations worth of experience in the industry, this is pretty young. For me, the average goat owner that I deal with more often than not comes into goats as their first form of livestock. Okay, even on some of the commercial operations, didn't really have livestock or production stock to a significant degree. Now we're into a commercial goat dairy. There is a population that maybe was raising a different species, for instance, dairy cattle, that then made a commodity group change. They wanted to continue being in commercial livestock, but the cows went out, the goats came in. And the motivations here, more than some of our other commodity groups, it's mostly in this list right here. About half of them have them for fun or hobby, right? And this is NAHMS data, so it actually is not including the people that have them for show or 4-H. They just like goats, right? Who doesn't like goats? And a relatively small proportion will have them because they got goats because they wanted to make money, right? And about half of that group that got goats is, again, similar to some of the clients I've mentioned before. They wanted to have goat's milk or goat cheese or something for personal consumption, and that drove them to get the animals. And then the other thing I've noticed, if I want to tag trends for our clients, is they're pretty well networked into each other. There's about half of them are associations of some kind of national membership, so ADGA is the big one for dairy goats. About a quarter of them have some kind of state or local membership. Again, I've noticed social media really emerging over the past decade or so as a way for goat owners to connect with each other, get information, share information, diagnose each other's animals, tell them how to treat it. Unfortunately for me, this line here, the vet usefulness, back in 2009, about a third of the goat owners thought vets were really useful as sources of information. About a third were like, and a third said no, they don't know anything. And as I've seen social media increase, my suspicion is that that may shift and probably not in our favor as much on this next NAHMS run. So for some of the husbandry norms, for dairy goats, just like dairy cattle, when you get out there, they're going to look skinny. If you're used to looking at meat goats or you're used to looking at sheep, they're kind of supposed to be that way, right? They're supposed to put their energy and resources into making milk. And this Saanen goat, a good high-producing commercial Saanen, she makes about 5% of her body weight in milk per day, right? That's a lot of milk. 1 to 5 kids per year. Now that 5 wouldn't be from a single kidding incident. That would be for a farm that's expecting them to kid out more than once a year on average. But I'd expect an average Saanen to probably be giving me, that's mature, to give me twins, pop out the occasional triplets. And they're what we call intermediate feeders. So they're not, compared to cattle or even sheep, they're going to be a little bit more picky about what they might eat in some ways, not as aggressive to the feed bone. So if we left them on just unimproved pasture, we can't expect this goat to maintain condition doing this up there. So the normal expectation is they're going to put a lot of energy in the milk. They're going to look thinner than similar non-dairy species. The ADGA, they do have their own body condition scale. It's still 1 to 5, but it's a little bit more complex than what I teach when I do sheep and goats and camelids as a rule. Okay, it's less simple, but there's some good training videos that have been put out there if you're interested on YouTube, made by ADGA. And we're going to generally feed them on some kind of forage or constant forage-based diet. And again, you're better off if most farms that are more commercial oriented will probably have them in a confinement setting, so dry lot or indoor housing. Expect to be bringing them forage that has been cultivated and tested with a known nutrient quantity, and then supplementing that forage with some kind of grain, usually a pelleted grain dairy goat ration. Again, a lot of times we see that fed in the parlor in order to get the energy and the protein into these animals to help sustain the lactation they're expecting to get. We start talking small operations, we start talking pets, we start to see more cultivated pasture come in, we potentially start to see some more unimproved pasture, and again, that will go with some of the lower production expectations. TMRs, total mixed rations, that are like the hallmark of dairy cattle feeding here in the US. You'll find them out on some farms. They can work with goats, but they're challenging to implement well in a goat herd because of how well these guys sort. And then some additional challenges with sensitivity to things like listeriosis. So what you will probably see is really high quality hay, especially alfalfa and alfalfa blend hays, and some kind of dry pellet. Okay, vaccines are a little bit over the place, but with our other small ruminants, CD&T vaccine, well, it's Clostridium type C and D with a tetanus, is basically core. We don't see as many of the 7 or 8 way types of clostridial vaccines as you may see on like a beef cattle operation. Occasionally, you might see a farm that's using something like a abortion vaccine, a chlamydia or a CAMPI. There are some mastitis vaccines that are out there targeted more towards Staph aureus control. In my experience, they're not really used that often on these herds. But you might find them in use at a farm. We don't generally tend to see as much of like the J5 E. coli or the salmonella types of mastitis vaccines used on dairy goats, because we don't generally have, with dry manure and kind of cleaner bedding environments, we don't generally have as much issue with those pathogens on mastitis. These guys, just like dairy cattle, this budding early in life where we have to burn the horn buds off to keep them from being horned is common. If these are like registered shown goats, they can't show with horns. So it's pretty normal across the industry if you see a dairy animal to have the horns taken off. And even if they're not really showing the goats, they're going to have a hard time selling a dairy goat to a dairy herd if it has horns and none of the rest of their herd does. So disbudding is definitely a common practice. With goats, it's hard to breed the horn trait out because we have an intersex condition that's associated with it if we breed polled animals to polled animals. So we don't have a great solution other than a hot iron for getting the horns off. Biosecurity, when I talk to goat clients, as a rule, the dairy goat side of the house tends to be more aware of and more focused on infectious disease and biosecurity than, say, like my meat goat clients would be, and some of the pet goat clients. So depending on what state they're in, especially with raw milk rules, they may be pretty aware of brucellosis and conduct brucellosis testing from a regulatory standpoint. The 3 diseases that I expect to say, hey, I went to go buy a goat, or I want to sell a goat, and the buyer's asking me did I test for X, Y, and Z, or hey, I was told I should ask the buyer to test for X, Y, and Z, is usually CAE, so caprine arthritis encephalomyelitis virus, Casey's lymphadenitis, and Johne's. As a vet, it gets challenging because the only one of those 3 that's a good individual animal test is the first one. The other 2, interpretation is more complicated than most of our clients will appreciate. But it is normal to see that, hey, I tested this goat at one point in its life for these 3 things, and it was, negative or not negative at the time. The other thing is the dairy goat industry for biosecurity tends to implement husbandry practices that help control specifically CAEV. So they're more likely to separate kids at birth and bottle raise them. They're more likely to do some kind of heat treatment or acidification process for colostrum to reduce CAE and Johne's transmission, and they're more likely to feed a pasteurized milk product to continue to reduce CAE transmission risk as they go through. We also see a fair amount of AI, probably more so than we do, say, like on a beef or a fiber goat farm, not beef, meat goat, or fiber goat farms in the dairy industry, but there's plenty of bucks out on farms for natural cover. So realistically, like commercial herds aren't going to go through and AI everything that's on the property. They'll pick and choose what's going to get straws, and they'll have some good quality bucks out there to cover the rest. You may have noticed that it was in the book on premiums, and winter milk was one of the premium options. Goats tend to be seasonal breeders. These continental type dairy goat breeds are more strongly seasonal than some of our boar goat breeds and other like scrub goat breeds. And because of that, if everybody is breeding at the same time, then everybody is kidding at the same time. Everybody goes into lactation at the same time. If they're all on about a 280 to 305 day lactation, they all go dry about the same time. And then these milk factories that have a lot of infrastructure are underserved in terms of not having milk come through the silos, usually over around the Christmas time frame. So it may be nice from a family perspective to know that you've got Christmas and New Year's off and nothing's milking, right? And you can have a little bit of a break. But if you're the processor with empty lines, they'll pay a premium for milk that can be produced at that point. That's why we'll see when it's possible, some of these herds will extend lactations for more persistency, or we'll try to use some synchronization programs to get these girls to breed out of season, so we have at least a portion of the herd in milk and producing during that winter milk season because they can get extra money with them. The other thing that is a challenge for dairy goat producers with the seasonality, we see and expect to see things like somatic cell counts to climb up as lactation goes on, right? Once they start cycling again, we can also see those climb. We have a pretty good challenge with subclinical intramammary infection in goat herds. So those bacterial counts can also climb. And if everyone's at the same point in lactation, so everybody's milk production is dropping off at the same time, and everybody's SCC is tending to climb at the same time, and we've gone through lactation where our intramammary infection rate has just kind of climbed, then we can run into troubles in the fall period with either somatic cell counts that exceed the PMO regulations, or I've had clients where even bacterial counts coming out of that bulk tank were starting to exceed things. That's a typo. right there, there's some discussion about changing the SEC limit. It should read 1.5, if I remember correctly, as was said earlier. There's always debate on dropping it down. Realistically, healthy goats on a well-managed farm can get under 500,000. Okay, there's some legitimate discussions on goats aren't cows relative to somatic cells, but there is also the fact that a healthy udder is a healthy udder, and we don't tend to have a lot of cell counts in when there's not infection. About half the herd is machine milked, but if you start, that's the national herd, right? So we start talking commercial farms, these bigger farms, they're gonna have parlors and machines. We start talking about the little farms, which there's a lot of them, but not a lot of goats. Those guys all tend to hand milk. You will see if you're out on the farms, we'll have parlor setups that are, that would be consistent with what we'd expect to see on a dairy operation in terms of milking equipment design. And we will also, on these small farms, have a lot of people that are either making these hand setups, or there's a few commercial products that are out there that no one in a cattle dairy would use anymore. They're all basically straight vacuum, to them, no pulsation to them, little hand pump types of things, or attaching a vacuum unit to some hosing to a cup. So you may be surprised a little bit on what you see if you see some of the milking equipment. Teat, dip, and prep, towels, post-dip issues is pretty variable. I'd say roughly 50-50 has been the historic norm, and I haven't seen that change a lot. I always have a little challenge with clients on advising them on this. On one hand, we know those are best practices that come from dairy cattle. On the other hand, some of the environmental challenges, because the manure is dry, the bedding is usually drier and cleaner than a dairy cow would see, we don't tend to have those coliform infections and as many of those environmental mastitis infections being a major mastitis concern on these herds. So it's hard to tell them that if they start using a pre-dip consistently, that we're really going to change udder health for the cow the same way I can confidently tell one of my cattle clients. Change the udder health for the goat the way I would normally tell a cattle client it would. And then dry off, so that's when we stop milking them. In general, like I said, they're on about a 10-month lactation. In general, we'll stop milking about 60 days before the next kids do, and a fraction of them will use some kind of intramammary treatment at dry off. And I think as we get clients that understand what happens with some of our subclinical and intramammary infections and how that affects milk quality and production in the herd, we start to see at least some attempts to identify those subclinical animals and treat them, even if we're not using it for the whole herd at once. Pathogens we probably do see on mastitis, coagulase negative staph, which we don't consider to be a primary pathogen for cattle. We do consider that to be a primary pathogen in small ruminants. These guys are mostly subclinical or mild clinical infections, and they're highly prevalent in pretty much any dairy herd I go into. They tend to add up over time as lactation goes on, and they're the ones that are really driving our bacterial and SEC counts in most herds. For clinical cases, we tend to see a lot of Staph aureus, especially these chronic udders. And then small ruminants, sheep and goats, can get a gangrenous mastitis. Again, usually those bad mastitises aren't an E. coli, but they can happen. They tend to be more a staph that created a blue bag syndrome or a Mannheimia. Okay, for scrapie ID, I mentioned before, we will see tags on especially commercial animals, tattoos for registered animals, especially when we start talking some of these pet-ish herds and we start talking these Nigerian dwarfs. I had a lot of clients that are really resistant to putting any kind of tag in the animal's ear, to the point where they're not going to comply with scrapie requirement mandates, right? Or they're adverse to complying with them. And so if we've got non-registered pet type animals, it can be a challenge to get these owners to put official ID and appropriate ID into them. So don't be surprised if you get out on properties and you see that. Obviously a herd that's showing regularly will have registered animals, and ones that are moving around will. From a welfare standpoint, we talk about that a lot with clients and students. If you're interested in what dairy goat welfare metrics could look like and what types of things we focus on, AWINS, the Animal Welfare Indicators, has an assessment. It's more EU oriented, so there's some efforts right now in the US to translate that into US operations and create some benchmarks that are appropriate for the US industry, but they're a good starting place. I always pay attention to lameness issues when I'm out on dairy goat operations, just like cattle. I wish I saw, in some places, saw animals that were a little bit sounder. Euthanasia and timely euthanasia, I think, is a concern for probably any of our production operations. I'd say that for dairy goats, we have a buck kid problem the way dairy cattle have a bull calf problem, except a dairy cow usually has one calf a year, right? So that's about 50% of your calves will wind up being boys, and dairy goats will typically average 2 or a little bit over 2 a year if you're doing once a year breeding. So we're at about 100% turnover. Depending on where you're at in the country, if we're near especially urban areas with heavy immigrant populations, so for the Midwest, Minneapolis, St. Paul area is a good example where there's a pretty strong market for goat meat, and a strong market for goat meat that would be acceptable to come from a dairy-oriented type of genetics. Then we can, those clients will maybe be able to find someone that wants those buck kids to raise them for a meat. If you're not near those areas, those can be a lot harder to sell. Some of the other cultures that tend to eat goat meat consistently are very more particular on what size or type of animal, and a dairy goat's not going to fit that market. So, okay. With that said, take whatever time is still available for questions. You've got resources that are good. I always put a plug in for the Small Ruminant Association. They do a lot of good work for small ruminant producers and small ruminant veterinarians, and have good resources and links. ADGA, the American Dairy Goat Association, is our major dairy goat group, and they have a lot of information on their website as well. Yeah.
So on the initial questionnaire that our enumerators are going out and doing, there's questions about the disbudding process. One thing I wasn't familiar with when the enumerators were asking was, do most people tend to disbud prior to budding beginning, or once budding happens? And they couldn't wrap their minds around why someone would disbud prior to. We were kind of talking, my best guess was, they know they're going to come through, so they do it in the location of. But
yeah, I can answer that a little bit. So, goat disbudding has some technical challenges associated with it. In dairy goats, for instance, we had a research project on goat kid disbudding, and we were using young bucklings or weathered bucklings in Saanens and Alpines predominantly that came from a commercial operation. And our IACUC, we had it in the IACUC that we were disbudding these guys at less than a week of age. So by the time the goats were born and we got the goats and we had a couple days of acclimation, we were generally in that maybe 5 to 7 day period when we did the procedure. Some of those Saanen bucklings already had horns. Okay, so when you start talking timeline, if you're in a commercial setting with our commercial continental breeds, then they will start changing from buds to horns very, very early in life. Okay, where dairy cattle, we have a much bigger window before we're going to see horn growth. Now, I will say Nigerian dwarfs tend to be a little bit slower. Other breeds are slower. Boar goats, we certainly don't see it that fast. So, but from a dairy goat standpoint, if it's kidding season and you've got 500 does and they are all kidding in a few weeks together, and it's usually maybe you and a little bit of help on the farm, and you've got now, 1,200 kids showing up, that's just a lot of work, right? So people miss the boat is reason number one. Reason number two is, especially we see this now with Nigerian dwarfs, is people don't know where the horn buds are. Or we do have a little bit more pulled genetics running, especially through the Nigerian dwarf breeds. They don't know if they have horns or where they are. Or they're new to goats and don't know how quickly the horns show up and don't know how to dehorn and don't know who to call on dehorning or something along those lines, right? So they may be waiting a little bit to try to be more sure of what they are getting. We also have the skull of those dairy goats, kids at that age, is super thin. And again, hot iron right now is our best option for removing horn buds. And it's really easy on those guys to create a thermal injury to the brain if you don't know what you're doing and you're not disbudding them appropriately. So I certainly understand the clients that are unsure about taking a hot iron to a goat kid at the age when it's probably best, right before that horn has emerged, to try to hot iron disbud them. And then the third issue with dairy goats, and again, this comes back even more with boys, but scur formation is really common, more so than dairy cows. Those the abnormal little horny growths, right? Because you didn't get all of it, and certainly experience with the procedure helps reduce scur formation. But if you are the world's master at dairy goat disbudding, I guarantee you, if you disbud enough goats in a year, you're still going to have some that have scurs. Especially on the boys and on the bucks. They're just really, really good at growing them. So that may be another motivation for some of the clients to wait, is that they feel like they've got a little better grasp of where that horn base is coming from and that they've gotten it all.
And kind of the side note to that then is dehorning as simple in goats as it is in cattle? Or straightforward?
Yes-ish. If we're talking about the process of taking a hot iron and burning the horn bud, right, for disbudding, then that is effectively the same as what we do in calves. If we're starting to have discussions over local anesthetic blocks and their utility and how to use them and do them, that's more complicated and less effective in goats than it is in cattle. Once we start talking mature animals, the horn base is a much larger relative percent of the skull in a more mature animal in goats than it is in cattle. And so once they've got an appreciable amount of horn, it becomes a much messier, more complicated procedure to try to remove that. Okay.
Awesome.
So seeing no other questions, thank you.